Yes, today's guest is a revolutionary. No, it's not William Wallace, it's Tom Byer. For over 20 years, Tom has changed the way football is taught and played in Japan, revolutionising youth development via his technical teaching programs. Tom now works throughout Asia and in the States, and is without doubt one of the most decorated and admired football coaches in the Asian region. Tom, how are you and the family?
Yeah, great, Kevin. Thank you for inviting me to address your club and whoever your audience is going to be tuning into.
Excellent. Where are you based, Tom? You've got the Houston Dynamo background there.
Yeah, that's funny. It's like it's a magic show. I'm here in Tokyo, but I do a lot of work with the professional club in the United States called the Houston Dynamo. And it just so happens that today I've been doing a lot of filming of content for the Dynamo here in my office. So I've got my Dynamo shirt and my Dynamo background. So I thought, wait, what the heck? We're talking to someone in Scotland. I'm in Tokyo. So we'll make it a little international flavor and we'll add my home country in. So yeah, I'm living in Japan for many, many years. But I do travel around the world and I work with lots of different organizations. So this is also to wake everybody up with the orange. It's pretty hard to kind of fall asleep if you've got this branding in the background.
Excellent. So, Tom, we've obviously been in lockdown around the world. How has lockdown been in Japan?
Yeah, it hasn't been as bad as most of the countries in the world. Japan went with a little bit of a different strategy. They went with a kind of a lockdown, but not the full, you know, bells and whistles of lockdown that you would consider in most of the other Western parts of the world. We've also been very, very fortunate to have a quite low rate of people who have both been infected, but more importantly, the mortality rate. Japan's a pretty, big populated country with about 125 million people, the last I checked. And I believe we've had less than 500 deaths from the COVID. So that's, of course, every death is unfortunate, but it seems for the, for the per capita of how big the country is, we've a little bit dodged the bullet, so to speak.
Nice, that's good to hear. Obviously, in the UK, it's a little bit different with the number of deaths, unfortunately. Um, did you manage to do much coaching during lockdown? Was it virtual sessions or anything like that?
Now, I mean, for me, myself personally, I've moved a little bit away from the actual coaching. I mean, compared to what I used to do, at least. But most of my work is consulting and, being on Zoom conference calls and things. But you're right. Here in Japan, it was affected. I have two young boys who play football, 11 and 14. So all of the training's been canceled. But on the good side of the lockdown on this side, kids can go outside and kick around and do what they want. So it wasn't that kind of lockdown where, from morning until night, you're just stuck inside the house. So we were very fortunate, but there has been no collective coaching or training sessions usually in Japan. Not completely, there has been some, but for the most part, people have stayed away from
Yeah, it's the same here. We're just starting to get out now, and we're allowed to do one-on-one session each day. So it's a positive step, but safety first, I guess. Right,
it.
Tom. It's really hard to know where to start. You've done so much in football and also in the media, but can we take it right back to the very start and how you started your football career? How did you get into
Sure.
football when you were younger?
Sure. Well, I was grown up in New York. I'm quite a bit older than you are. So I'm 59 years old, actually. And so I started playing, we call it soccer, although it's a bit of it feels even funny for me as an American because I've been lived most of my adult life outside of America. So I call it football. But I started playing football in New York. And I got involved because my brother started playing, who's older than me, and my brother's best friend's family had five brothers, and all of them played. So that's how I got started, and I was reasonably good from a young age, and also at the time we had what's called the North American Soccer League, which was the real big kind of start of the soccer boom, so to speak, a football boom in America. Because I lived in New York, we had the New York Cosmos, which Pele, Franz Beckenbauer played at that team, but also Johan Cruyff, George Best, I mean, some great players played in that league. So that really, I became a big follower of that league. So that's how it started. But I started young at a young age around my friends and my brother. But still, I mean, when I've seen the transformation between back in the 1960s and 70s to fast forward what's happening in America now with the Major League Soccer, it's amazing where we've come from and how far we've actually developed. So I started there, and then again, long story short, there's kind of a timeline, right, of like certain things that have happened during my career and my life, and another big part of the whole kind of interest in football was that I was born in New York City, the Bronx, but I moved upstate in the countryside when I was 10 years old. And we had a community college in our community called Ulster County Community College. Kind of funny, but Ulster is the name of it, right?
Yeah.
And that was a real strong perennial powerhouse in football and soccer. The head coach was Hungarian, and most of the players who played on the team were from Europe. So we had upstate New York when I was growing up, this huge influence of pretty high quality level play as well, mostly brought in from the Europeans. And my ancestry, my grandmother's side of my father's side is from Yugoslavia, from Croatia, Dubrovnik. So again, I had a little bit of European influence, but that's how I got started playing, at least in the United States. And it was my dream from a young boy to actually play on that community college team because there wasn't many local kids who were good enough to play on that community college team because most of the players came from New York City, Greeks, Italians, Croats, Yugoslavia back in the day, Italians, English. So it was tough actually for an American kid back in those days. But the happy ending to the story was the 2 years that I played there, I started every game. We went to the national tournament, and then I wound up moving down to the University of South Florida and got a scholarship. And that was kind of the background of things in the U.S.
See, before college, Tom, what kind of thing would you do? Just go out and play with your brothers and your friends? Would you? You mentioned the NASL started. Would you just mimic being Pele, Beckenbauer, Cruyff? Would you just try and replicate the moves that they were doing?
Well, there were two things that we focused on in those days: a tremendous amount of juggling the ball and mini games. It was very unstructured because excuse me, back in those days, there wasn't much structured organization in the game. I think we had like a summer league that ran like a couple of months. Back in those days, the first time you really played organized football or soccer was in high school. Even the elementary schools didn't have any. Junior high schools, or what we call middle schools, no organized play. So high school was the first time. So up until I joined high school, I played in a couple of like summer leagues. But aside from that, it was all the equivalent of like street soccer, street football, playing with my friends in parks and things like that. Not necessarily out in the street, but it was very unorganized and very unstructured play. So, I think that I got a good benefit from that as well. But it was really based in the community.
So all your skill acquisition, for lack of a better description, was self-taught. You and the ball, you with your
It really
friends.
was. And if I were to fast forward now, having become a technical coach and spent a couple of decades, almost an entire career on teaching technical skills, I would have been a great beneficiary of the knowledge that I have today if I knew that when I was a kid, but I didn't know that. So in those old days, the biggest thing was the best players were usually the best players at juggling the ball because they spent a lot of time with the ball or kicking against the wall. Now, those are two things that I don't necessarily encourage doing anymore because now I know a lot more and I've evolved and I'm a technical coach. So now the phrase or two words that we use is ball mastery is learning to do many things with the ball, which is much more, because, from a very young age, encouraging and practicing juggling the ball, unfortunately, takes a ridiculous amount of time to become good at it. So for me, I encourage more of the ball mastery stuff. But having said that, most of the time you'll find that the best jugglers of young kids on a team are usually the best players. And that just shows that they spend the most time with the ball.
I agree about juggling, but see the ball and the wall. Why do you discourage that? Is it is it
Well,
the kicking
I think,
element and it's not the ball mastery element?
yeah. Well, put it this way, I'll say with a caveat. It depends on what phase and what age.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to encourage a 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old to kick the ball all the time. But having said that, within, I'm just saying, within moderation. I mean, obviously nowadays, if I were to encourage the wall, I would encourage using the wall and then using the wall as a second player so that when the ball bounces back, you're working on your first touch. You're doing perhaps a move or turning, or you're doing something than just endlessly kicking the ball back and forth. So, in the beginning, a big part of our whole philosophy with Football Starts at Home is the discouraging of kicking and the encouraging of not just ball mastery, but just technical skills. And the other day, and I know because you follow me on social network, I posted something that got a ridiculous amount of attention on my Twitter. I think I have more than 500 likes on it almost today, and I only put up the other day. And all I did was I put a little phrase that was taking a picture out of a book about Pep Guardiola. And basically, Pep was asked a question like, what are you looking, what are the attributes that you look at, the characteristics of a player when you select a player? He said, that's very easy. I look for one thing and one thing only. Can they dribble the ball? Can they hold the ball? And that's whether you're a defender, whether you're a midfielder, whether you're a forward, or even a goalkeeper. Basically, are you good at 1 versus 1? Can you dribble well? Because all the other parts of the game you can teach. It's much easier. Passing, tactics, systems, formations. But if you can't hold the ball and you can't protect the ball, and you're not a master, and today, if you look at the players, today, like a Pep Guardiola Man City team or Liverpool or Man U or some of the big super club, Barcelona, obviously a better example, these are masters of the ball. These are masters. In the olden days, we thought that it was only really the forward going kind of attacking type players that needed to have good technical skills. But the modern day player today, including goalkeepers, is they must be masters of the ball. So I would rather focus smaller kids on that, but I probably change my thinking a little bit about the wall. Maybe the wall isn't bad, especially in this day and age when kids might not be able to participate with other players, but use it in a very intelligent way to work on other different skills.
It's interesting, Tom, about the Guardiola thing because most people see Guardiola and want to, at a young age, 10 years old, want their team to play this attractive passing style,
Yep.
and dribbling is discouraged. And
Well, I
that
think
sets a kid back a lot, doesn't it?
yeah, and I think that's where the football world kind of gets it wrong in the interpretation of a guy like Pep Guardiola, or even the interpretation of what like rondos are and what are the benefits of it. It's a little bit of a lack of understanding. And you got to remember, at the very top end level of the game, to become a professional player, you've got to have a certain level of technical ability, or you don't even get looked at. So you're right. I think that's a big problem with youth coaches because many of them want to play either the Barcelona way or the Ajax way. But the reality is that the players that they have, they can't even transfer the ball from the right foot to left foot, or they can't do a simple wall pass, or they can't do a simple overlap. So you've got coaches that have a lot of knowledge that are trying to apply it to kids that are technically poor. And a majority of kids that play football in most countries around the world, not just a few, but most of them are technically poor. And you see this in a lot of countries where the participation rate drops down. So, for example, if we stick with a country like America, where there's probably more kids who play football in America, it's like millions and millions because a lot of the kids who play are girls as well. But 38.5% of kids who play football or soccer in America, they quit by the age of 7, and then another 50% quit by the age of 10. So I tell people, I say I have a pretty good feeling. It's not the good kids that are quitting, it's the kids that are poorly developed. And of course, the older you get, the more time you have to train, more commitment, the more high level, and kids don't enjoy it, so they wind up dropping out.
It's interesting. Just from personal experience, when we get kids coming down to the academy, they're not technically balanced on both sides, so they're falling over. They can't master the ball, shift it left and right really quickly. Um, And at that point, it's difficult to learn that skill. And I'm talking 7, 8, 9 years old. Has that been your experience as well, and why you've sort of wrote your football starts at home book and asked, touches of the ball with asked parents to get the kids to touch the ball with both feet at an earlier age?
Yeah, well, it also stemmed from my overall just experience of working as a technical coach in, football, there's an ecosystem, right? So most people are just coaches. They coach, let's say, for example, you have a very long career as a coach for 30 years, right? You got a 30-year coaching career. Let's say that you've got 30 kids, which is a lot. I'm hedging on the more kids than less. So let's say you have 30 kids, okay, on a team. So you've got 30 kids for 30 years. That's only 900 kids over your whole career. So I've been very, very fortunate because of the way that my career turned out. And I became more of a football clinician and a coach. So I went around Japan for over 20 years doing these massive events for literally hundreds of thousands of kids. So I've literally seen and interacted with hundreds of thousands of kids. I've been in the media business of creating content. And when you create content and you're on TV, if your content's no good, you don't last long. But my football corner went daily on national TV here in Japan for 14 years. So we figured out what worked and we figured out what resonated. So if you're going around and you're doing events and, hundreds of thousands of kids, you're on TV, you've got football schools. So what happened is that I devised became experienced in a lot of different parts of football development, understanding media, working with brands and convincing brands to build strategies around some of our ideas, or convincing, a CEO of a major corporation like Volkswagen Group or Adidas or Coca-Cola. I've worked with a lot of these different groups. So I have a little bit of a different approach and a different perspective on development, working with professional clubs, working with federations, confederations, working with amateurs, working with schools, community clubs, elite programs. So I'm able to, and being fortunate to have worked in over, 20 some odd countries around the world. So I've been able to see a lot of things and connect a lot of dots. And so for me, obviously, when it comes to the technical stuff, that's my specialty. The younger children become technically competent, the more likely it is, first of all, they're going to stay in the game. The more likelihood is that player pool, the elite player pool, is going to come from those kids that are the best technical players as well. Because the reality is that most of the kids that don't have success, they're just not good. They never develop technically. So not to say that all kids can't develop technically and become better and improve, because they can. But the earlier you start, the more likelihood that you're going to have to develop really top-end football players.
Yeah, Tom, we're kind of jumping all over the place, but it is really, really interesting. How did you get from the States to Japan? I think you went via England first, but could you just give us a little background about how you eventually ended up in Japan?
Yeah, well, what happened was I didn't wind up in England, believe it or not. I went to community college, and then I took a year off. It's a long story. I got a scholarship to a University of Baltimore. I signed the contract, and then I realized I didn't want to go. So the penalty was I had to sit out a year. So I went over to England because my brother was in the Air Force, U.S. Air Force. He was stationed in a base called RAF Bentwaters, which is very close to Ipswich. Okay. So I went there and I played in what's called the Ipswich Suffolk League for a team called Leiston FC. And I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot there. And I also got exposed to Ipswich Town, which would later on, this is a long, long story. Paul Mariner, who was the big star of the team at the time, striker, also played 1982 World Cup in Spain. Ipswich were league champions under Bobby Robson, one of the biggest legends in English football. And later on, Paul Mariner would literally turn into becoming one of my best friends, who I talked to on a nearly daily basis. So he had a lot of influence on my career. So after that, I went to the States, and then that was the worst timing in America's history to be a young, aspiring professional, because the entire North American Soccer League folded. So I had a short little stint with the Tampa Bay Rowdies as a reserve, but never really caught on. Then I wound up over in Japan and got introduced to Japanese football from my community college coach who was Hungarian, who knew the head coach of one of the teams over here, a Dutchman by the name of Hans Oft, who later would go on to become the first ever foreign head coach of the Japan national team. And they introduced me to Hitachi Electric Company that owned the team. And so I was the first foreigner to ever step foot on the training pitch there. And that team was in the late 1980s. And then the J League was born in 1993, and Hitachi would be one of the founding members of the J League as well. So that's kind of how and then didn't have a long career playing, but then I got out of playing, fell in love with Japan, and remained here. And then the rest is kind of history.
That's a great story, Tom. How did you get into the coaching then? This is amazing, that sliding doors moment. Your Hungarian coach introduced you to
Yeah,
someone.
well, it also has to do with him. He had an enormous impact on my life. So growing up in upstate New York and being exposed to that college with the Hungarian coach, George Visvari is his name, I became very interested in coaching because in high school, even during the summertime, I don't know if you know, but in America, the camp business is huge, soccer camps in America. So I wound up working as like an assistant, kind of like an apprentice type of activity in these soccer camps. And it had a big influence. The English game had a big influence too, because a lot of the coaches who first came over on the first wave in America were English coaches. So I was surrounded by quite a bit of English coaches as well. And I loved the camaraderie. I just loved everything about, just being a part of the team. I still had a dream of being like a professional player, but that experience really, really changed me and affected me and influenced me. So when I got out of playing here in Japan, I turned into more what we call a football clinician, where I went around doing events. And I've been a coach. I coached like the under 12 national select team here in Japan for several years, actually, and was very successful. But most of my coaching has been in the specialty field of technical training. And for some people who don't understand what that is, it's basically working with individual players and trying to basically make them better. So it's more of an individual pursuit. But that's how I got into coaching. Yeah.
So Tom, you mentioned you went around nationally and put on these clinics, but you actually pitched the idea to Nestle to do this, to get the sponsorship and the funding to do this. Tom, I'm just trying to imagine this. That's like me going to Cadbury here in the UK and saying, "Can you give me some money so I can do this throughout the UK?" I wouldn't even get a look in. How did you manage to break down
Yeah.
that barrier?
Yeah, a couple of things. Yeah, I'll tell you the story. So when I got out of playing and I got into coaching, my Japanese language ability was not good. It's much better now, obviously. And so what I did was I just was volunteering to go around and coach anybody that would listen. So I contacted all of the international schools here in Japan, all of the military bases. There's a lot of American military bases here because they all had football or soccer programs, so I could speak English. So this was a big break for me, and it just goes to show persistence. I went down to a place called Kobe here in Japan, about a 3-hour train ride, and I was doing a coaching session for an international school called the Canadian Academy. And it was just one of these 1 or 2 hour things. I put a coaching session on, and I only asked one child, one kid. He's maybe around 10, 11 years old. And I said, "How long have you been in Japan? And what does your dad do?" And he said, "My dad works for Nestle." So I said, "Okay." And that was the only kid I asked. I came back to Tokyo, didn't really think much of it. And then I was sitting around in my apartment, and my roommate, who's Japanese, had a newspaper delivered every day. And I opened up the newspaper and I saw that Nestle was holding this international boys tournament for a brand called Milo, Milo. It's like a kind of a chocolate drink. And I thought, wow, didn't I meet some kid who said his dad worked for Nestle? So again, long story short, I I used the old push button dial phone, and I called down to the school, and the guy who arranged having me come down to do the training session, which was about a 3-hour train ride. It's not like down the street. And I think this could only happen back then. This would never happen today. I called the guy and I said, "Listen, I met some kid in your in the training session." He said his dad worked for Nestle. Oh, he goes, "That's the Yost family." So he literally gets like out the directory of the school, and he goes, here's his home number. So he gives me the number, pick up. We didn't have cell phones back then. I dialed the phone, and this is what happened, the conversation. Hello? The boy answered. I said, hi, this is Tom Byer, blah, blah, blah. And I said, you know, when I met you, you said your dad worked for Nestle. And I said, he goes, yeah. And I said, well, what is he home? And what does he do for Nestle? He said he's the president. So I got on the phone with the president, Alan Yost was his name. And I started explaining to him that I was looking for a sponsor to go around and do some events and this and that. And again, a long story short, he put me in touch with the guy who's the brand manager of Milo, a guy by the name of Mr. Toya. And I walked into that meeting, and the brand was being managed out of Tokyo. So and he's in Kobe. So I went to this meeting, and because it was top down as well, I walked out of that meeting in 1988, in the end of the year, December, having agreed to putting on 50 events around Japan starting in 1989. And I had no idea how I was going to do it, but I figured it out. And so then I went around and I started kind of finding friends of mine that I played with and that had other friends who could do all the things that I couldn't do. I couldn't speak good Japanese then, so I found a guy who could, you know, be a translator and speak English and Japanese. I didn't have a big enough name to attract people to come around, because when you work with brands, they only care about quantity, not quality. They want how many kids. So how could Tom Byer, who can't speak Japanese yet, go into a city 50 times and gather a couple of hundred kids? So I found in my network a guy who was a former national team star player, who that if we used him to make the phone calls, so it just all happened that way. And I always kept this throughout my whole career. I always tried to surround myself with people who could do things that were better than that I couldn't do. I consider myself a B or an A ranked guy, so I'm always looking for the A plus guy. I'm looking for the guy who's better than me. I want to make sure I'm not the smartest guy in the room when I go into a meeting, right? Because when you're the smartest guy in the room, you're in the wrong room. Okay, so that's the way that I've led my career, and so that was how it started. And I would go on to do these events for Nestle for 10 years. 10 years. That's what put me on the map here in Japan. And then there's a timeline. I got the TV show. I did this. I did that. But that was how it started. So for you young guys out there, you know, I wasn't a big star name. I wasn't a household name in Japan. Whereas, you know, fast forward now, majority of people who are involved in football would know me. But that's because of my media presence. And I also, it was key, I came to Japan way before the actual, what we call football boom, before the J League started in 93, before Japan hosted the World Cup in 2002. I came in the 80s, and I've done over 2,000 events for 500,000 kids. So Japan is divided up into 47 different states, and I've been to every state numerous times. So I've got literally friends and contacts in every single state in Japan.
That's brilliant, Tom. Obviously, you're a very resourceful guy, and you've partnered with a lot of big companies. Adidas, you mentioned, Coca-Cola, I think you mentioned as well. Those partnerships, I guess, opened a lot of doors for you, as well
Yeah.
as having the right contacts, which is an extremely resourceful way to do things. Let's just jump forward to that birth of the J League, Tom, 93, and I think then you introduced Guerver coaching to Japan. I think you successfully again pitched an idea to Fuji, I think.
Yeah.
What was
Yeah.
the...
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll,
go on, you
I'll
go,
end.
Tom, sorry, correct me.
No, it's okay. So Fuji was the name of a company. It wasn't Fujifilm, the brand,
Ah,
first of all. Fuji Project, that's the name of a company. It's just a private company. So what happened is I call it the perfect storm, right? In 1990, so just to for people keeping score at home here, I finished retired playing in 88. I started doing the Nestle clinics in 89. The J League starts in 93. So between 89 and 93, I've already got a pretty good network, and I'm getting a reputation of going around doing things with Nestle, doing those clinics. And then Japan throws the hat in the ring. And well, first of all, they established the J League in 93. But more importantly, they threw their hat in the ring to become the 2002 World Cup hosts. So everywhere you looked, it was football, football, football. So I started the Curver program. I introduced the Curver concept to Japan to a company called Fuji Project, which is a wealthy investor guy. And we created our first Curver coaching football schools here in 1993. And fast forward now, and there's over 120 full-time schools, 20,000 kids, turns over more than $20 million a year revenue. I spun out of it about 10 years ago. But the other really important timeline for my career is that, so you got 1993, Japan gets knocked out of, Japan came this close to qualifying for the 94 World Cup. They lost it. It's called the Nightmare in Doha, the Miracle in Doha, Qatar, where Japan was literally qualified for the World Cup and they lost in lost time to Iraq. Okay. And so they didn't qualify for 94. But then they'd qualify for 98. And that was a key year because that was also the year that they qualified not only for the 98 World Cup in France, but I started and got casted on Japan's #1 television show for children. So that's how the kind of the timeline goes when it comes to, you know, what these key kind of points along my timeline that have, you know, obviously helped me along the way. There's a lot of luck involved, but you also kind of create a lot of your own luck. And if you really, if I were to think of really kind of one word to describe, you know, the success I've had, it would be perseverance. Man, we're only talking about the successes. Do you have any idea how many times I knocked on companies' doors? How many times I called places? How many meetings I've had where people, you know, very few people turned up or didn't even follow it. So this whole idea of being like an overnight success doesn't happen. It's perseverance. It's basically taking risk, huge risk. And, you know, it's not easy. You know, I mean, I'm fortunate because I have a good media presence, and I've worked with a lot of big brands and things, but it's been a great journey and I'm not finished yet. You know, I mean, I wake up every morning feeling like I have more tomorrows than yesterdays. And for a guy my age, 59, usually you have more yesterdays than tomorrows. But because what I'm doing now, shifting gears into this football starts at home, which I'm sure we'll talk about as well. But I've got a whole kind of new meaning for what I do.
Brilliant. So talking about the successes, Tom, what was the impact rather of those clinics and then your appearance on TV on the technical level in Japan?
Yeah. Well, what was good was the Nestle clinics gave me an opportunity, first of all, to apply my skills and get out in front of people. I've learned Japanese. Everything I do is in Japanese. But more importantly, it created a network for me, a network. I didn't have any kind of deep philosophy or any kind of, you know, I hadn't introduced the whole Curver methodology yet. So imagine in 93, after I've been going around the country from 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, football's booming, J-League starting, the World Cup's coming, and now I can go back to my network and I can start now coming up with focusing and specializing in technical training, right? So then I've actually got something more than just going around to clinics and juggling the ball, playing mini games with the kids, playing like kind of little, you know, that's kind of the typical football event, so to speak. But now I'm introducing the importance of ball mastery. I'm introducing the importance of learning different things like changing direction with the ball, stopping and starting with the ball, 1v1 moves, you know, and then it's all coming first touch, passing and receiving, finishing. So it's putting it all together. And then it gets supercharged in 1998 because now I got a national television show, a platform to be able to speak to. When I was speaking to a couple of hundred people on a weekend, now I'm speaking to millions of people every weekday morning. And not just with the TV show, but with the TV show, I also got casted. I had a 2-page layout in Japan's #1 comic book called Koro Koro Comic. 1.3 million copies per month. And then also appearing in Soccer Digest, which is the biggest football or soccer coaching magazine for coaches and things. So that just supercharged everything. So literally everywhere you looked, we call it the horizontal market, the vertical market. So the horizontal market being people who are in the game, but the vertical market is just people who are, just not involved in football, but they're getting an awareness because we're doing events. We're in newspapers, we're in magazines, we're creating content, VHS videos. Number one selling instructional video in Japan was our video. On TV. So it's really a 360 approach to delivering the same message, the same consistent message. If you want to be a good football player, it all starts with the technical component. And we made ball mastery the center of development at the entry level for kids. And now fast forward, it's had a tremendous impact. When you look at, first of all, Japanese football, the characteristics, there's no doubt, jumps out. They're technical, technicians. And also we know that we've got just literally hundreds of professionals in the J League and on national teams, both the men and the women's side, that grew up and there was some touch point in our program, some touch point. They either came to our camps, our schools, our clinics, TV, magazine, books, whatever. There's something there. So that's a way that, we impacted the grassroots level of football.
There's no doubt about the impact. I'm fascinated. How did you manage to get onto TV in the first place? Again,
Yeah.
I think that would be like someone in the UK just going to a network and saying, "Can we just put something on the TV to teach kids
Again,
soccer skills?"
a little bit of luck because remember in 1998, Japan had qualified for their first ever World Cup tournament in France. I was a little bit lucky. There was a new TV show that was born out of the Pokemon. Okay. Now I joined that TV show for television. They go in what they call cools cycles. They're usually every quarter. Every quarter, it's how they divide up. So I joined the TV show. It's called Ohasta. I joined that show of April 1998, but the show started in October of 1997. So 1998, I started in April, but the show started in October. Two cycles before. And it just so happened I was lucky. There was one of the main guys who's on the show. It's not a football show. It's a pop culture show. They show video. They've got corners in it. Half of the show is live in the studio every morning from 7:05 in the morning. The VTR part starts at 6:45. And one of the main hosts of the show, who's an American actually, Raymond Johnson, very good friend of mine, he was in a meeting and they started talking about they wanted to create a football corner. So he jumped up and said, "Wait a minute, if we're going to do a football corner, I know the guy. I know who the guy is we're going to do it." So he introduced me to it. And then I brought Adidas in as well because I was working with Adidas. And we had just, launched the Curver program a few years earlier. So that just supercharged everything, man. I've got my own corner. The corner was named after me, Tom San's Soccer Techniques. And so here I am. I'm going around doing events. I'm the guy on TV going around doing events. I'm the guy in the #1 comic book who's going around too. So I became a bit of a celebrity, I was literally, the kids identified with me much greater than the players did, which is a bit weird, right? But that's the way and the power and the influence of media. So using that in a very positive way, we were able to influence, a generation or more of kids because that lasted 14 years.
Excellent. And then I think in that same year, Tom, in '98, you received a Golden Boot award from Adidas for your contribution to youth soccer in Asia. I think you're the only youth coach in the world to have received such an award. What are you thinking when you receive an award like that, Tom? I can only
Yeah,
imagine.
it was actually centered around the 1998 World Cup in France. I had been flown by Adidas to the World Cup draw in Marseille in 1997 because they always hold the World. It was in December, and that's when they honored me with this award. And I was quite surprised because I didn't know that I was even in the works to get this, and I was honored at a huge event for Adidas during the ceremony. So it was just for my recognition of contribution to grassroots football. And again, I'm the lucky. I wasn't on TV. I wasn't even on TV then yet. But I was very lucky because I was also working with a lot of great people in my staff too at the time. But anyway, I was the guy that got it, so it wasn't a bad thing to happen to me. So it was
Nice.
great.
What an honour. Let's jump forward a little bit, Tom. So 2007, you started a new company, T3. What was the motivation behind stepping away from the existing work and going out on your own?
Good question. I basically got a little bit burnt out from what I was doing. I introduced the Curver thing. I was doing the TV show. I was doing events. Mostly I was an event guy. I was doing over 70 to 80 events a year, which is a lot, mostly on weekends. And also, I had gotten married in 2002, but my first son was born in 2006. I spent a lot of time away. Um, but it was just, I felt like I couldn't do anything more for Japanese football. Here I am, I'm on the number one TV show for kids. I'm in the number one comic book. I'm doing events everywhere. I established the biggest, largest football school commercial business in the world. My VHS videos were number one. So I was like, just got a little bit burnt out. And I thought, well, what am I going to do? So I wound up leaving the Curver program. And then I just set up my own company. And then I continued with the TV show. I continued with some events. But then the big change was, is I decided that I wanted to get out of Japan. When I say get out of Japan, not move out of there, but I wanted to expand and basically leverage all of the sweat, equity, and time that I put into Japan. And Japan was doing well then. I mean, by 2000, since '98, they qualified for every World Cup tournament. So then I started venturing out to other places. There was interest from China because Japan was their nemesis always. So then I started getting out and basically doing it. But what happened was is that I basically was able to reinvent myself. That's really important. I was able to reinvent myself because that's when things started to really change really happened, because in 2006, my first son was born. And that's where I came up with this whole idea and was basically the genesis for the whole football starts at home. Because now I was Tom Byer, the popular guy, doing all the events. I got my own TV show, but I was always coaching other people's kids. I didn't have my own kids. So that was where I started to really wake up and started to understand many things that I didn't understand before. And that was a big, big turning point for me. And then I started putting all my energies into this kind of, really putting the developmental scheme under a microscope. And, that's when things really started to rock for me when I had my own kids.
When you say that, what do you mean? Did you come up with your own new methodology focusing on certain aspects? Was it an expansion of the media work?
So what happened is that in 2006, I was doing an event for Adidas, and they were giving me these little miniature balls. I was signing them autographs and giving them away to kids. And literally the proverbial apple, but this time ball, fell right in my lap. And while I was holding the ball, I remember my son had just started walking, and I said to the Adidas guys, I said, can you send me a few of these balls to my house? So a big box, a huge box of about 20 balls arrived. So I took 2 or 3 balls and put them in every room in the house. And because I'm a technical coach, I understood the importance of ball mastery. So I discouraged kicking from the beginning. I discouraged it. And I encouraged more of this ball manipulation, ball mastery. I started to see the amount of interest, the amount of attention, the ability to imitate when I'd show things with my child. And I saw that I basically made that ball the favorite toy. And I had inadvertently set my living room up, set the environment up, which made it very conducive to development. Now, that was by trial and error back in that day, whereas now today, fast forward, I can do it by design. And that's the reason I'm working with the Houston Dynamo behind me, and I work with lots of other organizations around the world, and why I've been invited to club teams such as Ajax or Dynamo Zagreb or Manchester United, or Mauricio Pochettino from Spurs wanted to see my presentation too. So that's all stems from this football starts at home. So I became very obsessed with football development and started studying like why there's only a handful of these countries that develop the best players. And for me, it's clear as the nose on the end of my face that, first of all, the entry level of the game is by far the most important, and that culture plays the biggest role when it comes to football development. So that's the whole genesis for my whole football starts at home. And then from there on, it just started kind of snowballing. And I was being asked to go around the world to attend football conferences. Now you got to remember, I'm an American by trade, by my passport. So can you imagine being invited to Manchester United by Ryan Giggs? And then after I showed him my presentation, he invited me to his restaurant, and Gary Neville, Phil Neville, Paul Scholes, and Nicky Butt were there. So again, I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back, but these are pretty big things for a guy like me who doesn't come from a footballing culture background of America. But I've been invited everywhere. Like I said, the Dutch have invited me, and probably some of the biggest football countries in the world. So I started to really connect a lot of dots, and connecting those dots was important because you can only really look forward and connect the dots by looking backwards of what you did. So we just talked about it for the last 30 minutes, right? All the Nestle clinics, all the technical stuff, the videos, the events, the schools, all of that. So all of that set me up and gave me the experience for me to arrive at the assumptions that I have today. And that is that football starts at home for most of the top players in the world.
See, when I've talked to parents and people in the past about getting a little size one ball and just getting the child to play with it at home, the arguments are, oh, they'll fall over and hurt themselves or they'll break something. Have you encountered those arguments before?
Yeah. Well, here's the pitch getting into that, right? Is that it's like anything to do with parenting. It's common sense. You're not going to obviously have a kid running around and there's a sharp coffee table that they might fall into. But I can just tell you from doing this for, more than 10 years now, more than that, 12 or 13 years we're going on now. Just a little basic common sense and there's no problem. But it's much bigger than just telling someone, oh, I read about this American guy, Tom Byer. He said, go out and get a couple of small balls and put them in the living room, and somehow the kid's going to play like Messi, right? There's a certain degree of understanding and knowledge that needs to be understood for parents. It's really football starts at home is more a developmental message, okay? And it's a message basically that shows that advanced countries' culture of development starts much earlier than the rest of the world. That's it, man. And so the program is backed up with science and research. It shows also that, the best players in the world, they start much earlier. And that's the reality of it. So when you connect dots and you study, like I have, the greatest players that have ever played the game, and I'm talking back in the old days of Johan Cruyff, Beckenbauer, Best, Pele, but today, which more people will identify with, Messi, Ronaldo, Neymar, Suarez, Iniesta, Pogba, Hazard, Lewandowski, Cruz, you just name them all, two common denominators. They all started playing between the ages of 2 and 5, and the role that parents played, and it was usually in and around the house. So if you understand that, it's very difficult to improve football overall if you just focus on coaching. It just doesn't happen. But unfortunately, the football world hasn't caught up to what science already knows, and that is that the learning and the development of technical skills happens much earlier than they suppose it. And I do that because I correlate by studying all of these national curriculums that have come out. And for the football world, the first time that a kid comes on the radar screen of a football association is between the ages of 6 and 9. They call it the discovery phase. And they build the characteristics of a 6 to 9-year-old. Clumsy, lacks motor skills, short attention span. So they believe just play fun games related to football. This whole idea of just play, the games, the balls, the teacher, let it play. Now, that's a very Eurocentric approach because many kids in Europe will come from a single sport culture where they're exposed to football from the time that they can walk until they join a team. So, of course, when they cross over the line into organized play, which is usually 6 years of age, they have some level of comfort with the ball. They can stop and start with the ball. They can dribble in a straight line and pull the ball back into a 90-degree angle and change direction with the ball. And that gives a huge, huge head start. That gives a huge, huge starting point that is very difficult to catch up. Never say never, but the kid who crosses over the line into organized play at age 6, if he or she is comfortable with the ball, learn how to protect the ball, stop, start, turn, change, cut direction, and protect the ball, that's a game changer, man. That kid's operating on a completely different level than the rest of the kids. And when that kid shows up to practice, that kid's the most popular because all the good kids, all the less developed, they want to be around the good kid. And the coach is going to always go to the best kid to ask him to demonstrate. So now a little 6-year-old is getting experience role modeling as a leader at 6. So when you marry now the neuroscience that goes as a big, huge part of our whole program, because we're fortunate we collaborate with one of the foremost neuropsychiatrists in the world from Harvard Medical School, Dr. John Rady, we know now that basically when a kid learns a skill by the age of 6, before crossing over the line into organized play, self-belief, self-esteem, self-confidence, and there's a bias that manifests that's very difficult to catch up to. So, for me, it's kind of amazing that the football world, the group that should know better, and I go around the world and I present at conferences, professional clubs. I mean, you're talking the top of football. And I've always been amazed, I'm not so much anymore, but amazed at the lack of understanding how young kids develop. Many people don't understand because most coaches and all the professional clubs, they inherit the best players. They inherit them. You're very rarely going to find a guy like myself who's working with kids at the entry level all the way through to the elites. It almost never happens. But I've documented it. And what I documented was, what could a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old be able to do with a ball? What's the difference between what a 3-year-old can do and a 4 and 5-year-old? Well, I documented that. And I know because I'm getting the reaction when I show a guy like Ryan Giggs, perhaps one of the great players of all time, of his era, for sure. And I see the reaction, man. I see the reaction when I got a guy like Rio Ferdinand gets on an airplane from London, flies over to China, and he wants to see my presentation. I show it to him, and then he folds his arms and leans back in his chair. And this is what he said, quote unquote, "Is it too late for an 8-year-old because I've been doing everything wrong with my son?" Now, I'm not saying that to disrespect these guys. These guys are the best of the best, but just shows that we've got a big gap here of understanding of even guys who win Champions League or Captain England. There's a missing piece of the puzzle. So we tend to focus mostly on coaches and coaches' education. I say that's the reason why we've got the same serial repeat winners in all the tournaments, because those are countries that have figured things out, and they themselves can't even explain why their players are good. When I was researching Neymar, there was an article. When I research players, I want to know, when did they first come in contact with the ball and who facilitated that? When did that happen and where? So Neymar is a typical epitome of football starts at home. So I was reading an interview by his father, and his father said this. He said, "People don't understand. Down here in Brazil, no kid falls in love with football. They fall in love with the ball. They fall in love with the ball, and that facilitates falling in love with the game of football." So I can't help but compare and say that in most other countries in the world, we try to force the kids to fall in love with football, and the ball gets in the way. So if you understand that, you're probably halfway there to figuring out the whole development question on how to develop players, because it's that, there's another quote by Roy Keane, have a slide in there. He says, "Skill was and never will be the result of coaching. It's a love affair between child and ball." Provocative statement. We're not saying that coaches aren't important, but when you look at the best of the best, they learn their technical skills away from the organized training. Can we as coaches make players better? Absolutely. But when it comes to skill acquisition, it seems that the role that the parents play is 100 times bigger than what the coaches do. So if you figure that out, you might want to put a strategy or build a strategy around that, because to me, parents and the entry level is by far the most significant.
Tom, it's all in the book, and I love the book. I'll put a link to the book where you can buy it in the description of this video. And I really think more coaches should study and read it, and probably more parents as well. Do you think if your work was adopted more by national federations and nations even, that the player level would increase? Take Scotland as an example. We used to be really good at football for a small nation, and now not so much. Something's going wrong somewhere, and that might be part of the puzzle, the football starts at home element.
Yeah, I think it is. To answer your question, yes, yes, yes. Elaborate a little bit more. Um, I find I've worked with lots of federations, confederations, but I find that the professional clubs are more suited for our program because they're more connected to community. And this falls in the context of families. It doesn't fall in the context of teams. So anything you do with federations and things is teams, players, coaches education, competition, elite player development, coaches education, all of that, right? And what happens is that in most countries in the world, the approach is we need more coaches, we need more educated coaches. We need a defined, organized, structured curriculum. We need to have our elite player pathways very well defined. We need the foreign experts to come in and hold our hand and show us what worked for them. And I say, okay, do all that. But the reality is that any system, tactic, or formation you play is always going to be dependent upon the individual players you have in those systems. So you could bring Pep Guardiola, Jose Mourinho, Arsene Wenger, and Sir Alex Ferguson to any of these like really developing countries, and after a couple of years, they'll go home frustrated, and you'll see very little to be accomplished because it's not a coaching problem. It's not a coaching problem. It's more the culture. So, you know, we went through this exercise in China where China spent over $100 million to have Marcello Lippi, one of the great Italian coaches, come out and couldn't beat countries like Hong Kong and Thailand, you know, so there needs to be, you know, a real rethink on development. I like to think that at least we're helping to contribute to that narrative because everywhere I go, people get it. But you got to remember too, this is very important. This is a long-term investment, and I'm not talking even financial. I'm just saying it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. You don't go. But the problem is that people that are involved in football administration, they need short-term wins. They need to win today. They need a 2 or 3 year plan, not a 10 or 15-year-old, 20-year-old plan. They're not going to be around. They're not going to be at that organization by the time the results come. So it's hard to get them excited about it. But the professional clubs, they're the ones that are the best partners for us, at least.
It's fascinating. So national federations they're really guilty of, oh, the Dutch are doing well, let's copy the Dutch model. 5 years later, 6 years later, the Spanish are doing well, let's rip up that model and copy the Spanish. There's no consistency over a longer period like you're talking about. Tom, you mentioned that I think you've got two sons.
Yes.
Obviously, football starts at home. That principle, that methodology was adopted in your house. How have your sons developed, do you think, as a result of I want to call it a methodology. I know it's not a methodology, it's a program. But how do you think they've developed in
Here,
comparison to other kids their age?
sure. So both my boys play on teams. And in Japan, when you select a captain or the numbers of the players, depending on what, but all I can tell you is fast forward now, I have an 11-year-old and a 14-year-old, and both of my boys, both on their club teams, wear number 10, and both of them are the captains. Now, again, that's not to say that my kids are going to be the best kids in the world, but I can tell you this. I helped to set up at least my kids for success. And technique is like riding a bicycle. It basically, technical skills, and this is the really important part that coaches and people need to understand. The execution of technical skills is an unconscious process. It's developed and stored in the brain. That's why repetition is key. Repetition basically hardwires the brain and the nervous system. That's why it's so important to do things repetitively over and over and over again. Now, I took a very hands-off approach to my kids. Once they crossed over that line into organized practice at 6 years of age, I've played little to nothing when it comes to my kids' development. So my kids, I took a hands-off approach only because of my media presence here in Japan, and I don't want my kids to be pressured because when my kids show up to competition, they will get singled out. That's Tom Byer's kid, right? So then, you know, that's a big burden on my kids. So I've been very, very sensitive, probably a little bit too much sensitive about it. But my boys are, you know, they're top players. They're the best players on both of their teams. And I'm not even, I could care less if they play professional or they go on to play. If they do, that's okay, great. But I'm just happy that they enjoy football and that they're lifetime football people now, and then they enjoy it. I don't put any pressure on them, but they surely have the foundation upon building upon whether they wanted to go to a higher level. And the reality is that just being technically competent isn't guaranteeing anything, because as we know, as football people, there's a lot of luck involved. There's desire, there's time, there's everything. But my kids, but the one thing is pretty clear: if you don't have the technical foundation, it's very difficult to become a top footballer. That's just the characteristic of playing football.
It's also difficult to stay in the game. So the kids who are
It's
technically
just
competent,
distraction.
yeah,
I have the same challenge as everybody else. My kids love to play Fortnite on the computers. They like to do other things with their friends. It's very hard to stay focused on certain things. But the good thing about Japan is, from a football perspective, is that football and all sports in general is a specialization from a certain age, because the season goes 52 weeks a year.
wow,
So that's not to say that my kids don't enjoy doing other things, because they played football as their main sport. They swim, they play basketball, fun with their friends. They play lacrosse, they play ping pong, they ride bicycles, they do all of the stuff that kids do. So they get a lot of motor skills development. And that's, again, environment and culture, because in Japan here, little 6-year-old kids walk to kindergarten by themselves because of the culture and the safety element here in Japan. So we're blessed with certain characteristics that, again, make it conducive. Kids can run out, on their bicycles in the morning and come back in the evening. And that's in a city, like an urban city like Tokyo, which is the most populated city in the world. So those are all benefits that help in, developing players.
brilliant. Tom, last question, and I'm sure you get asked this quite a lot, but what's changed for you coaching wise over the last 30 years? If you can pick
Yep.
one or two things.
Yeah, 100%. The biggest thing that changed my entire perspective on coaching is when I got exposed and started collaborating with Dr. John Rady from Harvard Medical School. It all came together for me, because I'd always had very good mentors as coaches. I'd always understood the coaching side. I've taken coaching licenses. I've been an instructor on licenses. I watch a lot of football. I played a lot of football. But when it came to the neuroscience and the way that kids learn and the way that the body is hardwired, and this whole understanding that nerve cells that fire together, wire together, and create these neural pathways and networks, and that this technical development is a very unconscious process, massive eye opener for me. And then also becoming a parent and understanding my role and my child's need for parental approval and attention and praise supercharges that learning, because an emotional environment. And again, just to recap, emotionally charged environment is deep learning and long-term memory, man. That's it. So I think that the football world can learn a lot from the neuroscience world of the way that kids learn and the stages of development, because again, the football world hasn't caught up to what science does. It happens much earlier than supposed. So that's the biggest takeaway for me. And from my work, that's the most gratifying, because I can go into a presentation with a room full of 500 parents, and after an hour, I can walk out of that meeting being satisfied that parents have learned more than probably I learned in 20 years about development in that 1 hour. And so what my whole goal is to try to inspire people into action and get parents to participate in their child's development. And that's the most satisfying, gratifying thing I can do, because I see it, because I get the feedback from parents later on, thanking us for engaging them and helping them to help their kids. And one of the greatest things in life is as a parent, being able to help your children. That's a huge gift in life.
Easy to get by in when you put it like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Tom, listen, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you today. I've loved hearing your stories and the history behind your journey to Japan, your methodology. You are without doubt one of the world's leading thinkers on youth development and how technical skills are taught at an early age. So, from a personal point of view, I've learnt a lot from this last hour, as you just mentioned, to be like one of those parents. So thanks, Tom.
No, thank you, Kevin, for letting me address you. I'll tell you what, I rarely turn down any interviews because I realize how important it is to try to get our word out to as many people as possible. So thank you for the opportunity.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tom.
You're welcome.